That cold morning, no one expected an act of compassion to change everything. What started as another quiet day near the reserve became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here every roar and every breath matters, because behind every white tiger there is a story worth saving. The frost clung to the pine needles like a fragile promise, cracking under the weight of dawn's first light. In the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, where the Idaho wilderness met the frayed edges of human settlement, the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Elias Thorne had risen before the sun, as he always did, his boots crunching over the gravel path to the ranger station. At 42, Elias was a man carved from the same unyielding stone as the peaks around him. Broad-shouldered, with calloused hands that spoke of years spent mending fences and tracking elusive shadows in the underbrush, he wasn't one for words. His world was measured in the quiet rhythms of patrols and the occasional crackle of his radio. The station was a squat cabin of weathered cedar, its windows fogged from the night's chill. Inside, the coffee percolated with a low hiss, and Elias poured a mug, steam curling up like a ghost. He glanced at the map pinned to the wall, marking the boundaries of the White Claw Preserve, a vast expanse of forest where the last wild white tigers clung to survival. They weren't native here, not truly, escaped or released from some long-forgotten circus or private collection. Their pale coats a stark anomaly against the shadowed greens. Elias had seen them only in glimpses over the years. A flash of white through the trees, a distant roar that echoed like a warning. He respected their wildness, kept his distance. That's how you survived out here. But that morning, as he stepped onto the porch with his mug in hand, a sound pierced the silence. It wasn't the usual chorus of birds or the rustle of wind through the aspens. It was a low, labored rumble, like gravel shifting under pressure. Elias froze, his breath visible in the crisp air. The sound came again, weaker this time, from the tree line beyond the clearing. He set the mug down, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung by the door. Not out of fear, but habit. Rangers didn't draw weapons lightly, but the preserve had its dangers. Poachers, black bears roused too early from hibernation, or worse, the unpredictable fury of a cornered animal. He moved toward the sound, his steps deliberate, the frost giving way beneath his boots. The trees parted to reveal a narrow trail, one he knew led to an old watering hole where deer gathered at dusk. But there, slumped against the base of a massive Douglas fir, was something that stopped his heart. A white tigress. Her fur, once a pristine cascade of snow and shadow, was matted with mud and streaked with the faint metallic tang of blood. She lay on her side, her massive chest heaving in shallow, ragged bursts. Her eyes, golden slits amid the pale, were half-lidded, fixed on nothing and everything at once, and from her body the unmistakable strain of labor, contractions rippling through her flanks, each one pulling a guttural whine from her throat. Elias's radio crackled to life before he could process it. "Thorne, you copy? Got reports of a vehicle on the east fence line. Possible trespassers." It was dispatch from town, a young voice named Lena, efficient but edged with the boredom of routine. He thumbed the button, his voice steady despite the tremor in his gut. "Copy that. I'm occupied. Send Harper if you can." Harper was the other ranger, a wiry veteran who handled the paperwork while Elias handled the wild. The tigress's head lifted slightly as he approached, her breath fogging the air in weak puffs. Up close, she was immense even in her vulnerability. Easily 400 pounds, her muscles taut under the fur, now slack with exhaustion. Elias had read the reports. White tigers were rare, their genes a cruel twist of nature that left them striking but often sickly, prone to vision problems and weakened immunity. This one looked like she'd been fighting for weeks, perhaps months. starved, maybe injured from a territorial scrap, and now, in labor, cubs. In the wild, that meant survival for some, death for others. But here, on the edge of the preserve, it meant something else entirely. He knelt at a safe distance, his knees sinking into the cold soil. "Easy, girl," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Her eyes met his, not with the feral glare he'd half expected, but with a weary plea, her pupils dilating in the dim light. The scent of wet fur and something sharper, effort, desperation, filled his nostrils. No gore marred the scene, just the quiet dignity of struggle, her paws twitching faintly, claws retracted as another contraction racked her body. A soft, mewling cry escaped her. Not a roar, but the sound of a mother on the brink. Back at the station, Elias's mind raced. Protocol said, call the Wildlife Rehab Center in Missoula, 40 miles away over winding roads, slick with ice. But by the time they arrived, she might be gone. He thought of the townsfolk in nearby Harlan's Gap, a cluster of ranchers and loggers who viewed the preserve as an intrusion. "That white ghost'll eat your livestock," they'd grumble at the diner, their moral stances clear. Wildlife was to be managed, not coddled. Dangerous, unworthy of the risk. Elias had heard it all. Stories of a tiger mauling a hiker years back. Though no one could prove it was this one. Fear painted them all as monsters, yet here she was, silently judging him with those eyes, not attacking, not fleeing, just breathing, struggling, her body a testament to instinct's unyielding pull. Elias's hand hovered, then dropped to his side. He wasn't a vet. His skills stopped at splints and sedatives for black bears. But something stirred in him, a flicker of the boy who'd once nursed the orphaned fawn back to health, only to lose it to the coyotes. Failure lingered like an old scar. He pulled out his phone, the signal faint but holding. The first call was to Dr. Mira Voss, the vet from the Reserve's Edge Clinic. Her voice came sharp over the line. "Elias? What's the situation?" "Tigress, white one. In labor, down by the watering hole. She's fading fast." A pause, the sound of papers rustling. "I'm 20 minutes out. Keep her calm, no sudden moves." Mira was the pragmatist, mid-30s with a no-nonsense braid and hands steady as steel. She'd saved eagles and wolves, but tigers, that was uncharted. As he waited, Elias shed his jacket, draping it over a low branch to block the wind. A small act, insignificant against the cold, seeping into her bones, but it was something. Her breathing hitched, eyes locking on his again, and in that moment, the world narrowed. "If we don't help her, no one will." The words echoed unspoken in the silence between her labored exhales. The crunch of tires on gravel announced Mira's arrival, her truck skidding to a halt. She emerged with a kit slung over her shoulder, her face paling at the sight. God, Elias, she's huge, and those eyes. They stood there, two humans trembling on the edge of decision. The tigress's weak rumble underscoring the moral suspense. Save her, risk everything, or walk away and let nature claim its due. But as the first weak cry of a cub pierced the air, faint, insistent, Mira knelt beside him, her hands already gloved. The rescue had begun, though none of them knew yet what it would unearth. Mira's truck idled in the clearing, its engine a low growl that seemed to echo the tigress's fading rumbles. The frost had begun to melt under the rising sun, turning the ground into a slick mosaic of mud and pine needles. Elias watched as Mira unpacked her kit with practiced efficiency. Syringes glinting in the light, bandages rolled tight, a portable ultrasound machine that looked out of place amid the wild sprawl. She was the picture of resolve, her dark hair pulled back, cheeks flushed from the cold drive. But her eyes, sharp and assessing, betrayed the tremor in her voice when she spoke. "She's in distress. Elias, contractions are too close, could be dystocia. The cub's position might be wrong." Mira knelt closer, her breath mingling with the tigress's invisible clouds. The animal didn't flinch. Instead, her massive head shifted slightly, nostrils flaring at the new scent. Trust, fragile as new ice, hung in the air between them. Elias nodded, his own hands steadying a makeshift barrier of branches to keep the tigress contained without crowding her. He'd seen births in the wild before, deer fawns slipping into the world under moonlight, elk calves wobbling to their feet. But this was different. This white tigress, with her ethereal coat dulled by exhaustion, carried the weight of rarity. Whispers in town called her the ghost of the preserve, a spectre blamed for missing calves and shadowed tracks. Dangerous, the ranchers said at Harlan's Gap's lone diner, their forks pausing mid-bite. Shoot it before it comes closer. Unworthy of the risk, they meant. Wildlife was a resource to be culled, not a life to be cradled. Yet here, in the hush of the forest edge, the tigress's eyes held no threat. They were wide now, golden pools reflecting the canopy's dappled light, pleading in the language of instinct. Her flanks quivered with another contraction, a silent wave that arched her back without a sound beyond the soft expulsion of breath. Elias felt the pull in his chest, a moral suspense coiling like the roots beneath his feet. Walk away, and let the preserve's balance hold. Intervene and invite chaos, the tigress's claws, infection, or the wrath of those who saw compassion as weakness. Mira worked in near silence, her gloved hands gentle as she administered a low-dose sedative through a dart gun fired from a few feet away. The tigress's eyelids fluttered, her body sagging deeper into the earth, but her breathing steadied, if only for a moment. "This buys us time," Mira whispered, more to the air than to him. She was no stranger to judgment. As the reserve's vet, she'd faced the town council's scowls when she advocated for non-lethal traps. "They're just animals," one elder had spat during a meeting, his moral stance etched in the lines of his weathered face. Survival meant dominance, not mercy. Mira believed otherwise, her hands a bridge between worlds, but doubt flickered in her pauses, the way her fingers hesitated before touch. The first cub emerged then, slick and small, its white fur matted against a tiny, heaving chest. Mira scooped it up with a blanket from her kit, rubbing it vigorously to stimulate breath. A weak mule broke the quiet, the sound raw and insistent, like wind through cracked wood. Elias's throat tightened. He hadn't expected the surge of protectiveness, the way the cub's blind eyes seemed to search for warmth. He thought of his own losses, the wife who'd left years ago, taking their unborn dreams with her, failure in the quiet hours when the station's walls closed in. This cub, fragile as a promise, stirred that old ache. But there was no time for reverie. The tigress stirred, her low whine sharpening as another contraction gripped her. Mira's face hardened. There's more, at least two, but she's bleeding internally. Pressure's building. She glanced at Elias, her voice dropping. "We need to get her to the clinic. Truck bed, padded, but moving her. It's risky." Elias scanned the tree line, the preserve's vastness pressing in. The world here was a patchwork of reserve boundaries and rural fringes. Harlan's Gap to the south, with its dusty roads and flickering neon signs, the forest's heart to the north, where white tigers like this one roamed in dwindling numbers. Supporting hands were few. Old man Harlan himself, the rancher whose land bordered the east fence, might help with his flatbed. But his stance was clear from years of complaints. "That cat's a curse," he'd mutter over coffee, eyes hard with the memory of a lost dog pack. Fearful, always fearful, while the tigress lay silent, her body a canvas of misunderstood strength. A crackle from Elias's radio shattered the moment. "Thorne, Harper here. Dispatch sent me your way. What's the hold-up on that vehicle report?" Harper's voice was gruff, laced with the impatience of a man who'd patrolled these woods for decades. He pulled up in his Ranger Jeep moments later, dust from the trail still settling on his khaki uniform. At 58, Harper was the veteran, his face a map of scars from brambles and bad decisions. He took one look at the scene and whistled low. "Jesus, Elias, a white one in labor. Call the feds, let 'em handle it." Mira shot him a look, her hands never stopping as she monitored the Tigress's vitals. And wait for her to die? No, we stabilize here, move her ourselves. Harper's moral stance was pragmatic, born of too many close calls, animals put down for safety's sake. Risky business, he grumbled, but he didn't walk away. Instead, he fetched ropes from his jeep, his silence speaking of reluctant alliance. The emotional turn came unbidden in the space between breaths. Elias knelt closer, his hand extending, not to touch, but to offer presence. The Tigress's gaze met his again, her pupils contracting in the light, a flicker of recognition or exhaustion. He whispered, barely audible, "Hold on, girl, we've got you." Mira paused, her eyes meeting his, tears held back behind a professional mask. The cub in her arms nuzzled weakly against the blanket, its tiny paws kneading. "If we don't help her, no one will." The words hung unspoken, awakening something deeper, the raw thread of compassion weaving through fear. Tension rose as the second cub struggled. Mira's ultrasound hummed faintly, revealing the tangle within. "Breach," she murmured, sweat beading on her brow despite the chill. Field surgery loomed, her kit opening to reveal tools that gleamed like judgments. Harper paced, radio in hand, calling for backup from the rehab center in Missoula. The Tigress's breaths grew shallower, her body trembling under the weight of instinct's demand. Elias felt the world's eyes on them, the silent forest, the distant town, the Tigress's pleading stare, forcing a confrontation with their own souls. As Mira prepared the incision, careful and contained, a deeper truth began to surface in Elias's mind. Years ago, on a patrol much like this, he'd found a wounded wolf pup and left it, protocol be damned. The guilt had festered, a shadow in his quiet days. Now, with the Tigress's life ebbing, redemption whispered through the cold air. The cub's mule strengthened, a small victory amid the struggle, reframing the peril into purpose. But the Tigress's eyes dimmed, her rumble fading to a sigh, and the rescue teetered on the edge of loss. The forest held its breath as Mira's scalpel hovered, the blade catching a stray beam of sunlight that pierced the canopy like a hesitant judgment. The Tigress lay still, under the sedative's veil, her massive form a pale island, amid the encroaching mud and fallen leaves. Elias could hear the distant hum of Harper's jeep idling, a mechanical heartbeat against the wild's pulse. The air thickened with the scent of pine sap and the faint, earthy tang of the Tigress's labored warmth. No blood yet, just the quiet anticipation of it, contained in the precise arc of Mira's hands. She worked methodically, her breaths measured, each exhale a soft cloud that dissolved into the chill. "Breach presentation," she murmured, more to steady herself than to inform. The ultrasound screen flickered beside her, a grainy window into the Tigress's hidden world. A cub, twisted awkwardly, its form a shadow against the mother's fading strength. Elias knelt opposite, his fingers pressing a clean cloth to the Tigress's flank, feeling the subtle tremors beneath the fur. Her eyes, half open now, drifted toward him, golden slits that seemed to pierce the veil of his resolve. In that gaze, there was no accusation, only the raw vulnerability of survival's edge, a silent plea that twisted something deep in his chest. Harper stood back, arms crossed, his boots shifting restlessly in the softening frost. He was the voice of the town's undercurrent, the pragmatic chorus that echoed from Harlan's Gap's porches and the reserve's fence lines. "This ain't right, Doc," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly, laced with the weight of years spent drawing lines between man and beast. One wrong twitch, and she's on you or us. Folks in town hear about this, they'll say we invited the devil in. His moral stance was etched in the furrow of his brow. Wildlife was to be respected from afar, managed with rifles and regulations, not cradled like a lost child. Dangerous, they called her kind, unworthy of the gamble when livestock wandered and shadows moved in the night. Fear painted the white tigers as harbingers, ghosts unworthy of the blood and sweat. But Mira didn't pause. Her hands moved with the grace of someone who had stared down death in sterile rooms and storm-lashed fields alike. If we don't, she dies here, and the cubs with her. The incision was small, precise, a whisper of intervention in the grand indifference of the wild. The tigress's chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, her breath a ragged whisper that synced with the rustle of wind through the aspens. Elias watched, transfixed, as Mira's gloved fingers delved gently, guiding the second cub free. It emerged slick and still, its tiny body limp against the blanket Mira laid it on. She rubbed it with urgent strokes, her own breath hitching as the cub remained silent, its chest unmoving. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken dread. Elias's hand tightened on the cloth, his knuckles whitening. He thought of the wolf pup again, that long-ago failure, its whimpers fading into the underbrush as he turned away, protocol a cold shield against his cowardice. The guilt had burrowed deep, surfacing in quiet nights when the preserved silence mocked his solitude. Now, with the tigress's life ebbing under his touch, the parallel clawed at him. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a reckoning, her struggling form forcing him to confront the man he'd become, isolated, scarred by choices unmade. A faint mewl broke the tension, the second cub stirring weakly, its eyes sealed shut against the world. Mira exhaled sharply, relief cracking her composure as she wrapped it beside its sibling. But the tigress's whine sharpened, a low vibration that rattled through the ground. Internal bleeding, Mira had warned, the pressure building like a storm unspoken. Her vitals monitor beeped erratically from the kit, a mechanical judge in the organic drama. She's stabilizing, but barely, Mira said, her voice threaded with exhaustion. She sutured the incision with steady pulls, each stitch a thread of hope woven into the fabric of instinct. Harper stepped forward then, his reluctance giving way to action. He fetched a stretcher from his jeep, canvas and poles rigged for bear traps, now repurposed for this ethereal creature. Together, they lifted her, the tigress's weight immense even in sedation, her body sagging like a fallen branch. Elias bore the front, his shoulders straining under the fur's damp warmth, her breath feathering against his arm in weak puffs. The cubs, bundled in Mira's coat, mewled softly from her arms, their sounds a fragile counterpoint to the crunch of boots on the trail. The extraction was a slow procession, the world narrowing to the rhythm of their steps, mud sucking at heels, branches snagging at sleeves, the tigress's tail dragging a faint trail in the earth. Tension coiled with every shift, a paw twitching, a low rumble escaping her throat that set Harper's hand hovering near his sidearm. "Easy now," Elias whispered, not to her, but to the fear gnawing at them all. The preserve's edge blurred into the rural sprawl beyond, empty highways flanked by barbed wire, engines cooling in distant driveways, the faint glow of Harlan's Gap's lights winking through the trees. Here, humans confronted their morality in the quiet hours, ranchers mending fences at dawn, nurses in the town's clinic bandaging wounds both seen and unseen. As they reached the truck, Mira climbed into the bed first, arranging padding from tarps and blankets. The tigress was eased in beside her, her head lolling against Mira's thigh. Elias paused, meeting the animal's gaze one last time. Those golden eyes, dim but unyielding, holding a depth that reframed the peril. In her, he saw his own unspoken losses, the daughter he'd never had, The life unlived beyond the ranger's badge. Redemption flickered, not in grand gestures, but in this act, kneeling in the cold, hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of choosing kindness over indifference. The engine roared to life, Harper at the wheel, navigating the winding road toward Missoula's rehab center. Dust kicked up in the rear view, the forest receding like a memory. Mira monitored the tigress's breaths, her hand resting lightly on the pale fur, tears finally spilling unchecked down her cheeks. The cubs nuzzled closer, their warmth a small defiance against the dying light. But as the truck jolted over a rut, the tigress's body convulsed once, sharply, her eyes fluttering shut. A deeper crisis loomed, the revelation of her true frailty pulling them toward an uncertain horizon. The road stretched on, cold mornings giving way to the uncertainty of what lay ahead, where survival hung by the thinnest thread of compassion. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and compassion can travel. The truck rumbled over the uneven road, its suspension groaning under the weight of the makeshift cargo. Harper gripped the wheel with white-knuckled hands, his eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the twisting path ahead. The Bitterroot Mountains loomed on either side, their peaks shrouded in a thin veil of mist that clung like unresolved doubt. Elias sat in the passenger seat, his body rigid, every jolt sending a fresh wave of tension through him. In the bed behind, Mira cradled the tigress's head in her lap, the cubs bundled against her side, their faint mules lost to the wind whipping through the open tailgate. The air smelled of diesel and damp fur, a gritty reminder of the fragile boundary they'd crossed. The tigress's convulsion had come without warning, a sharp arch of her spine, her paws scraping faintly against the padded tarp. Mira's hand pressed steady on her chest, feeling the erratic thud beneath the pale coat. "She's crashing," Mira said softly, her voice barely rising above the engine's drone. No panic, just the quiet certainty of someone who'd danced too close to loss before. The monitor from her kit beeped insistently now, clipped to the side of the truck bed, its screen glowing with erratic lines that traced the tigress's fading pulse. Internal bleeding, the pressure from the birth compounding some hidden injury, perhaps a rib cracked in a fall, or the slow seep from starvation's toll. The white fur, so striking in the forest's gloom, now seemed almost translucent under the midday light, revealing the veins beneath like faint rivers on a map. Elias twisted in his seat, catching glimpses through the small rear window. The tigress's eyes were closed, her breaths coming in shallow hitches, each one a labored pull against the inevitable. He remembered the wolf pup again, clearer now, the way its small body had gone still under his indifferent gaze, the forest swallowing its final whimper. That failure had carved hollows in him, turning quiet patrols into echoes of what-ifs. Here, in this rattling truck, the parallels sharpened. The tigress wasn't just an animal, she was a mirror, her struggle forcing him to weigh his own unspoken burdens, save her, and perhaps mend the fracture in his soul. Let her go, and carry the weight into another solitary dawn. Harper broke the silence first, his voice rough as the gravel under the tires. "Rehab's still 30 miles. If she goes, it's on us. Town'll say we played God with a killer." He was the embodiment of the rural town's divided heart. Harlan's Gap, with its weathered barns and flickering diner lights, where folks gathered at dusk to swap stories of shadows in the woods. The white tigers were myths to them, beautiful curses, escaped from some distant cage, preying on the unwary. Unworthy, the old-timers muttered over their coffee, their moral stances rooted in fences torn and nights spent guarding herds. Fear turned the tigress's majesty into menace, her pale form a ghost to be exorcised, not embraced. Harper shared that wariness, his scars from a long-ago bear encounter a constant reminder of nature's indifference. Yet he drove on, his foot steady on the gas, the silence between them thick with reluctant commitment. Mira didn't respond, her focus on the IV line she'd rigged from her kit, saline dripping slowly into the tigress's foreleg. The cubs stirred against her, their tiny bodies warm anchors in the chill wind. But nuzzled closer, its blind face turning toward the sound of her heartbeat, a silent bond forming in the chaos. Tears traced silent paths down Mira's cheeks, held back no longer, her breath hitching as she whispered encouragements to the air. "Breathe, girl, just breathe." Her hands trembled now, not from cold, but from the raw edge of empathy, the way the tigress's vulnerability stripped away the barriers between species. In the clinic back home, she'd patched up coyotes and eagles, but this felt personal, a confrontation with her own losses. The brother she'd lost to the wild years ago, swept away in a flash flood, his body never found. Compassion, she'd learned, was born from such voids, a quiet rebellion against the world's harsh judgments. The road dipped into a valley, the truck's headlights cutting through pockets of fog even in daylight. Elias's radio crackled faintly, dispatch checking in, Lena's voice a distant thread. "Thorn, status, Harper's signals spotty." He thumbed it off without reply, the weight of explanation too heavy. Instead, he watched the landscape blur, empty highways flanked by skeletal aspens, dust swirling in the truck's wake like forgotten promises. The preserve's edge gave way to scattered ranches, where smoke curled from chimneys and dogs barked at the passing vehicle. Humans here lived on the knife's edge of wilderness. Nurses in the local clinic bandaging hunters' wounds. Photographers capturing fleeting glimpses of the wild for calendars no one bought. Their moral stances varied. Some saw the tiger as a sign to expand the fences, others as a fleeting beauty to be left alone. But none had knelt in the frost, felt the heat of her struggle seep through their gloves. Tension crested as the tigress's body seized again, a low rumble vibrating through the truck bed. Mira's face paled, her hands flying to compress the wound site, the sutures straining under the pressure. "Elias, pull over. We need to stabilize now." Harper swerved to the shoulder, gravel spraying, the engine cutting to a hush. They piled out into the cold afternoon air, the highway stretching empty in both directions. Elias helped lift the tigress's head, his arms encircling her neck with a gentleness born of necessity. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, locking onto his, golden, dimmed but piercing, holding a depth that spoke of instincts unbroken. In that gaze, a deeper truth surfaced for Elias. The tigress's white coat wasn't just rarity. It was survival's quiet defiance, much like the daughter he'd imagined in quieter moments. A life unlived, but mourned. She'd been the ghost in his marriage's unraveling, the what could have been that left him adrift. Now her plea reframed his guilt. The wolf pup's death not as isolation's end, but a call to this moment, where redemption lay in the tremble of his hands. Mira worked feverishly, injecting epinephrine to counter the shock, her whispers a litany against the fading. "Come on. Fight it." The cubs mewled louder, as if sensing the precipice, their small forms pressing against the tigress's side. Harper stood sentinel, scanning the road for traffic that never came, his pragmatic facade cracking as he muttered a half-prayer under his breath. The world held still, wind whispering through roadside pines, the distant call of a hawk, the tigress's chest rising in a single, defiant heave. No gore stained the scene, just the profound ache of breath withheld, eyes that judged not with fury, but with the innocence of need. As the crisis ebbed, her pulse steadying to a fragile rhythm, Mira leaned back, exhaustion etching lines around her eyes. They reloaded carefully, the truck lurching back onto the road toward Missoula. The revelation lingered in the air, unspoken. This rescue wasn't about the tigress alone, but the humans she unbound, forcing them to see their own misunderstood strengths. Elias stared ahead, the mountains softening into horizon, where hope flickered like the first stars. Survival demanded more than instinct. It required the courage to choose kindness amid the fear. The rehab center's lights beckoned in the distance, a beacon against the gathering dusk. But the true test of their bond waited within those walls. The rehab center's gates creaked open under the weight of Harper's truck, the tires crunching over gravel that seemed to echo the Tigress's faint, uneven breaths. Missoula's outskirts blurred into focus, low buildings huddled against the encroaching dusk, their windows glowing like hesitant eyes. The facility was a sanctuary of sorts, chain-link fences topped with razor wire, enclosures whispering with the soft calls of rehabilitated owls and foxes, the air laced with the clean scent of antiseptic mingling with wild earth. Elias stepped out first, his legs numb from the hours on the road, the cold seeping through his jacket like an uninvited memory. Mira emerged from the bed, cradling the tigress's head with one arm, while the other supported the bundled cubs. The animal's pale fur caught the floodlight's harsh glow, turning her into a spectral figure, majestic even in collapse, her flanks rising in shallow waves that spoke of battles unfinished. The second convulsion on the highway had left her weaker, her golden eyes half-lidded, fixed on the horizon as if willing the stars to align. No roar escaped her now, just the soft rasp of air through parted jaws, a sound that tugged at the edges of Elias's resolve. He'd felt her warmth against him during the lift, the subtle shift of muscle under fur, a reminder that life clung fiercely even here. Dr. Lena Reyes met them at the loading dock, her white coat flapping in the evening breeze like a flag of surrender. At 38, she was the center's lead surgeon, her face sharp and unyielding, etched with the quiet authority of someone who'd pieced together shattered wings and mended fractured bones. She'd been alerted by Harper's radio call, her team already prepping the surgical suite. Stainless steel tables under bright lamps, monitors humming in anticipation. "Bring her in," she said, her voice steady but edged with the gravity of rarity. White tigers weren't common in these parts. Their arrival stirred the same whispers that haunted Harlan's Gap. Ghosts in the wild, beautiful but burdensome, their survival a question of worth. The team moved with practiced silence, a stretcher gliding across the concrete like a shadow. Elias and Harper flanked the Tigress, their hands steady on the canvas, feeling the heat radiate from her body in uneven pulses. The cubs, now 3 in total after Mira's roadside efforts had coaxed a third from the weakened form during a brief stabilization, muled softly from a warming box nearby. Tiny miracles, their white coats pristine, eyes still sealed against the world, but the Tigress's struggle overshadowed them. Her tail twitched faintly, an instinctive warning or plea as they wheeled her into the sterile light. Inside the suite, the air hummed with tension, the scent of iodine sharp against the undercurrent of fur and exhaustion. Lena's hands, gloved and precise, assessed the sutures Mira had placed, holding but strained, the internal bleed a hidden river threatening to flood. "Hypertension's critical," she murmured, hooking up IV lines with swift efficiency. The monitors beeped in erratic symphony, tracing lines that danced like fragile hopes. Elias stood back, his presence a quiet anchor, watching as the Tigress was positioned on the table, her massive form dwarfing the space. Her eyes met his again through the haze, golden and unwavering, stripping away the clinical veil to reveal the raw innocence beneath, the misunderstood strength of a mother fighting for shadows, yet unborn. Harper lingered by the door, his arms crossed, the weight of the town's judgments heavy on his shoulders. "This one's a fighter," he said lowly, more to fill the silence than convince himself. Back in Harlan's Gap, stories would already be brewing, the rangers who'd tampered with fate, risking lives for a creature deemed dangerous. Unworthy, the ranchers would say, their moral stances forged in the fires of lost herds and sleepless vigils. Fear turned the Tigress's plea into peril, her pale beauty a lure for folly. Harper felt it too, the pull of pragmatism urging retreat. But the sight of her trembling flanks held him fast, a silent judgment that questioned his own scars, the bear that had nearly claimed him years ago, leaving him to wonder if mercy had a place in survival's code. Mira assisted Lena, her hands steady despite the fatigue etching shadows under her eyes. The emotional turn deepened in the quiet intervals, as Lena prepared for exploratory surgery. Probing the source of the bleed, Mira leaned close to the tigress's ear, whispering words lost to the hum of machines. "You're not alone now." Tears traced silent paths down her face, held back no longer, her breath hitching at the sight of the animal's labored rise and fall. Compassion bloomed from such vulnerability, a small act amid the crisis, stroking the fur gently, feeling the warmth that defied the cold sterility. If we don't help her, no one will. The mantra echoed unspoken, awakening the moral center of the room, where humans confronted their frailties in the glow of monitors and the tigress's unblinking gaze. Tension escalated as the incision reopened, Lena's scalpel revealing the damage. A ruptured vessel from the birth strain, compounded by what looked like an old wound, perhaps from a poacher's trap or territorial clash. No gore spilled dramatically, just the contained flow of life ebbing, staunched by clamps and sutures that pulled like threads of fate. The tigress's body arched once under the anesthesia, a low rumble vibrating through the table, setting hearts racing. Elias stepped forward instinctively, his hand resting on her paw, claws retracted, pads warm and trusting. The contact grounded him, the tremor in his fingers betraying the storm within. He thought of the daughter again, the imagined life that had slipped away with his marriage's end, a loss buried under ranger duties and solitary trails. This tigress, with her silent endurance, forced the truth to surface. His failures weren't endpoints, but echoes calling him to this redemption, where choosing to stay meant reclaiming the kindness he'd long suppressed. Lena worked through the night, the hours blurring into a slow burn of precision and prayer. The cubs, tended in an incubator nearby, stirred with growing vigor, one nuzzling the warmth, its tiny chest rising in steady rhythm. But as the surgery progressed, a deeper revelation stirred. Within the tigress, beyond the bleed, lay an anomaly. A fourth cub, smaller than the others, its form pale and still on the ultrasound. "Wait," Lena breathed, her voice cracking the silence. They coaxed it free, the tiny body emerging not with the expected white coat, but streaked with faint golden bands, a genetic throwback, rare even among whites. It didn't breathe at first, its chest silent, leaving the room suspended in speechless awe. Mira rubbed it gently, her hands trembling, as a faint mewl finally pierced the hush, the cub's eyes cracking open to reveal not gold, but a piercing blue, like fragments of sky trapped in fur. The sight reframed everything. The tigress's struggle wasn't mere survival, but the quiet miracle of diversity, her body a vessel for nature's unspoken poetry. Elias's throat tightened, the cub's anomaly mirroring his own hidden fractures. The boy who dreamed of family, now finding purpose in this hybrid bond. Harper exhaled slowly, his pragmatic walls crumbling at the sight, while Lena sutured the final close. Her eyes wide with the weight of what they'd witnessed. The tigress's breath steadied, her eyes fluttering open to regard the small form beside her, a rumble of contentment vibrating low. Outside, the cold morning light filtered through the windows, dust motes dancing like possibilities. The rescue had unearthed more than lives. It had laid bare the souls involved, compassion forging silent justice in the face of fear. But as the tigress nuzzled her unusual cub, the true test of their redemption loomed, nurturing this fragile family back to the wild, where instincts and hope intertwined against the indifferent horizon. The rehab center's surgical suite gave way to the dim hush of the recovery ward, where the air hummed, with the soft whir of humidifiers and the distant patter of rain against the reinforced windows. Dawn had broken fully now, painting the room in muted greys, the light filtering through blinds like hesitant fingers probing old wounds. The Tigress lay on a padded platform, her massive form swathed in warming blankets that rose and fell with the steady rhythm of her breaths, shallower than before, but holding a fragile truce with the night's ordeal. Her golden eyes, no longer dimmed by pain, swept the space with quiet vigilance, lingering on the incubator where her cubs nestled. Three mirrored her pale majesty, their white fur fluffed against the heat lamps, tiny paws kneading in sleep. But the fourth, the anomaly with its golden streaks and piercing blue eyes, stirred restlessly, its mewls sharper, insistent, as if protesting the confines of its new world. Elias leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, the ache in his shoulders a dull echo of the hours spent lifting and holding. He hadn't left since the surgery, his ranger's jacket draped over a chair like a shed skin. The scent of antiseptic clung to everything, undercut by the earthy warmth of the cubs, a reminder that life persisted in the cracks of crisis. Lena Reyes moved about the room with measured steps, checking monitors and adjusting IV drips, her face a mask of professional calm. But her pauses betrayed her, the way her hand lingered near the Tigress's flank, fingers hovering without touch, as if afraid to break the spell. At 38, she'd seen miracles in this place. A bald eagle taking flight after a wing rebuild, a fox kit surviving a snare's bite. Yet this Tigress, with her ethereal coat and the secret she'd borne, stirred something deeper, a confrontation with the wild's unscripted poetry, where compassion demanded risks beyond the scalpel. Harper had stepped out for coffee, but his absence left the room heavier, his earlier mutterings echoing in Elias's mind. "That odd one's a wild card," he'd grumbled before leaving, his moral stance rooted in the preserve's hard edges. Survival meant uniformity, not deviations that could draw unwanted eyes. Back in Harlan's Gap, word would spread like wildfire through the diner and over backyard fences. The rangers who'd brought a freak of nature into the fold, tempting fate with a creature already whispered to be cursed. Dangerous, the townsfolk would say, their fear twisting the Tigress's beauty into something profane. Unworthy of the resources, when farms struggled and winters bit deep. Harper embodied that divide, his scars a testament to boundaries crossed and regretted, yet he'd stayed through the night, his silence a reluctant bridge. Mira sat cross-legged on the floor beside the incubator, her braid loosened, strands framing a face etched with exhaustion. She watched the unique cub, its blue eyes now half open, fixing on her with an intensity that belied its frailty. The little one's coat gleamed under the lights, golden bands like sunlit veins against the white, a genetic echo from some distant ancestor, rare and uncharted even in white tiger lore. It had been the weakest at birth, its chest still for agonizing seconds before that first mule shattered the hush. Now it pushed against its siblings, nuzzling toward the glass as if seeking the Tigress's rumble. Mira's hand pressed flat against the warm surface, her breath sinking with the cub's tiny heaves. Tears had dried on her cheeks, leaving faint tracks, but her eyes held a fierce tenderness, born from the flood that had claimed her brother years ago, a loss that taught her the wild's indifference could be met with hands outstretched, not turned away. The Tigress shifted then, a low vibration rumbling from her chest, her head lifting to regard the incubator. Her eyes met Mira's through the glass, golden and profound, holding a silent acknowledgement that bridged the divide. No words passed, just the quiet language of instinct, the cub's mewl sharpening, the mother's flanks quivering in response. Elias felt it too, the pull in his gut, a moral suspense coiling anew as the unique cub faltered, its breaths hitching irregularly. Lena noticed first, her steps quickening to the monitor. Hypothermia is setting in. The others are stabilizing, but this one, its markings might mean weaker thermoregulation. She adjusted the heat, her voice dropping to a whisper, hands trembling slightly as she lifted the cub for skin-to-skin contact against the tigress's side. The mother didn't recoil. Instead, her tongue rasped gently over the tiny form, warm and deliberate, drawing the cub closer. In that moment, the emotional turn deepened, a small act of compassion unfolding in the sterile glow. Elias knelt beside Mira, his hand joining hers on the incubator's edge, feeling the vibration of the tigress's purr through the floor. "She's teaching them," he murmured, the words rough in the silence. The cub's blue eyes fluttered, locking onto his for a heartbeat, reframing the room's tension into something sacred. He thought of his imagined daughter again, the life that had dissolved in unspoken grief, leaving him to wander the preserve's trails like a ghost. This cub, with its mismatched beauty, mirrored that hidden fracture, a reminder that redemption came not in perfection, but in embracing the flawed, the unexpected. The tigress's gaze shifted to him, her rumble softening, as if recognizing the parallel struggle, her innocence forcing him to confront the man who'd hidden behind duty. Tension rose as the cub's mules weakened, the golden bands seeming to fade under the strain. Lena prepared a feeding tube, her team filtering in quietly. A young tech with wide eyes, a wildlife photographer who'd arrived unbidden, camera slung but unused, capturing the scene in memory alone. The photographer, an elderly woman named Clara from the rural town's edges, had her own stance. Years of lenses trained on the wild had taught her beauty's cost, the way humans misjudged shadows as threats. "They're not monsters," she whispered to no one, her voice trembling with held-back tears. "Just trying to live." Her presence added weight, the contrast sharp. Fearful judgments from afar versus this intimate plea, the tigress's breaths a steady anchor amid the crisis. Mira took the cub gently, wrapping it in a warmed cloth against her chest, her heartbeat a surrogate rhythm. The tigress watched, her paw extending slightly, claws sheathed, a gesture of trust that silenced the room. Elias's throat tightened, the revelation crystallizing. This family wasn't just surviving, they were rewriting the narrative of misunderstanding, their bond a quiet justice against the world's harsh verdicts. The cub's breaths steadied, nuzzling into Mira's warmth, its blue eyes closing in fragile peace. Outside, rain softened to a drizzle, the cold morning yielding to hints of sun. Dust in the wind, carrying whispers of hope. But as the tigress nuzzled her brood closer, a faint rumble escaped her, a warning or contentment. The true depth of their connection lingered, pulling the humans deeper into the wild's unspoken redemption. The horizon waited, where instincts and kindness would test them all. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of this white tiger reach more people who still believe in kindness. Weeks blurred into a tentative rhythm at the rehab center, the rain-slicked windows framing days that stretched like the tigress's recovering breaths. Slow, deliberate, each one a small victory etched in the quiet. The facility's enclosures hummed with subdued life, the rustle of leaves in outdoor pens, the occasional cry of a mending owl piercing the hush. But in the recovery ward, the air held a different weight, thick with the unspoken bonds forming between worlds. The tigress, now named Luna by Mira, in a moment of hushed whimsy, after the moon's pale glow that mirrored her coat, lounged on her platform, her flanks no longer heaving but rising in steady swells. Her golden eyes, sharp once more, tracked the movements around her with a watchful patience, instinct guiding her toward the incubator where her cubs tumbled in playful clumsiness. Elias found himself returning daily, his ranger duties pulling him back to the preserve, only to draw him here again. The winding roads a meditative blur of empty highways and cooling engines. The frost of that first morning had given way to spring's tentative thaw, mud pooling in the gravel lots like forgotten tears. He stood now by the observation window, his hands in his pockets, watching as Luna extended a massive paw toward the glass enclosure. The cubs, 3 pristine whites and the golden-streaked one with its piercing blue eyes, nuzzled against the barrier, their mules a chorus of need and discovery. The unique cub, dubbed Soul by Clara the photographer during one of her visits, pressed closest, its tiny form vibrating with a restless energy that set it apart. Luna's rumble responded low and resonant, a vibration that traveled through the floor, drawing Elias's gaze to her face, eyes half-lidded in contentment, but flickering with the fierce protectiveness of a mother reclaiming her strength. Mira joined him at the window, her coat dusted with the faint scent of milk formula and earth from the feeding rounds. Exhaustion had softened her edges, but her eyes held a quiet fire, the kind born from nights spent whispering encouragements to fading forms. "She's bonding," she said softly, her breath fogging the glass. No more tears, but the hitch in her voice spoke of the emotional undercurrent, the way Luna's recovery had unearthed her own buried grief, the brother's loss, a shadow lifted by this silent alliance. Lena Reyes moved in the background, her clipboard a shield against the vulnerability, adjusting the enclosure's humidity with hands that no longer trembled. She'd confided once in the dim light of the break room about a case years ago, a wolf pup lost to infection, a failure that had hardened her resolve. Now, with Luna's steady pulse on the monitors, redemption whispered through the routine, her moral stance shifting from detached precision to a deeper empathy, where saving one life reframed the worth of all. Harper's visits were rarer, his Jeep's engine fading into the distance after brief checks, but his silence carried weight. From Harlan's Gap, he'd relayed the town's murmurs, ranchers at the diner eyeing him askance, their judgments a low rumble of fear. "That white devil and her freak litter, they'll be back tearing through fences." "Dangerous, unworthy," the chorus went, their stances rooted in the rural sprawl's harsh necessities, livestock guarded by floodlights, nights spent with rifles at hand. Harper nodded along, but his eyes drifted to the horizon, where the preserve's trees met the sky, the tigress's innocence challenging his pragmatism. He'd failed animals before, putting down strays to prevent greater harm, but Luna's gaze through the enclosure's bars had lingered, a silent plea that questioned the lines he'd drawn. Clara, the elderly photographer, captured it all in sketches now, her camera set aside for pencils that traced the cub's forms with trembling care. Her moral stance was one of witness. Years on the forest edges, lenses trained on fleeting majesties, had taught her the cost of misunderstanding. "They're not ghosts," she'd murmur to Elias during her afternoons, her voice frail but unyielding, tears held back behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Just survivors, like us." The unique cub, Soul, drew her most, its blue eyes locking on her sketches, as if recognizing the intent behind the lines. In Soul's anomaly lay a deeper truth, nature's quiet defiance, a genetic echo that reframed rarity not as curse, but as hope's unexpected form. The emotional turn came in the small hours, when the center quieted to a hush broken only by Luna's contented rumbles. Elias entered the ward one evening, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the floor. Soul had faltered again that day, its breaths hitching in the incubator, the golden bands dulling under fever's touch. Mira knelt by the enclosure, her hand extended through the bars, Luna's tongue rasping gently over Soul's fur in a maternal reassurance. Elias joined her, kneeling in the dim light, his fingers brushing the cool metal. Luna's eyes met his, golden and profound, holding a recognition that spanned the divide, instinct acknowledging the hands that had pulled her from the brink. "If we hadn't," Mira whispered, the words trailing into silence, her breath sinking with the cub's strengthening mules. Tension lingered in the periphery. The rehab team's debates over release, the town's distant pressures to relocate the problem family, the wild's call pulling against the safety of walls. But here, in the silence, compassion wove through it all. A small act of presence, Elias's hand steady as Sul nuzzled closer, its blue eyes fluttering open to regard him. The revelation settled deep. Luna's suffering hadn't just been endured, it had unbound them, forcing confrontations with fears unspoken. The lost daughter in Elias's quiet nights, Mira's flood-haunted dreams, Lena's clinical scars. Soul's uniqueness reframed the narrative, a living testament to bonds forged in vulnerability, where misunderstood strength became shared redemption. As weeks turned to months, the enclosures opened to acclimation pens, the air alive with the cub's bounding energy. Luna led them now, her strides purposeful, white coat gleaming under the summer sun. Elias watched from the fence line one final dawn, the cold mornings a memory, dust swirling in the wind as engines idled in the distance. The family moved as one, Luna pausing to rumble encouragement, the cubs tumbling after. Soul's golden streaks catching the light like promises kept. They slipped into the preserve's heart, vanishing into the tree line, a white tigress walking into the horizon with her cubs, their forms a silhouette against the vast sky. In that image lingered the world's quiet need, instinct's raw pull, survival's unyielding grace, compassion's light-piercing fear's shadow. Kindness wasn't weakness. It was the thread holding the wild and the human in fragile harmony, a reminder that every breath, every choice, mattered in the face of indifference. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching. The case of rescuer helps a dying white tigress in labor. What came out left? Everyone speechless. See you in the next one.